This is the HIS 121 Test 3 review. Number one, what is meant by the term antebellum? That just is a Latin term that means before the war. It refers to the time period, the decade or two leading into the U.S. Civil War that began in 1861. So we're talking about the period of the 1830s, 1840s, 1850s, and how the characteristics, especially in the South, existed during that time period. So antebellum just means prior to the war. Number two, what was the economic significance of cotton in the South and in the United States? Cotton was by far the most significant crop, not only in the South, but really throughout the country. It accounted for nearly half of all exports from the United States up until 1860, just before the war began. So cotton was extremely important from an economic perspective, but it also was the primary reason that slavery was so entrenched in the South, because of the demand for slaves created by the planting and harvesting of cotton. Number three, what state sold more slaves in domestic slave trade than any other? The U.S. Constitution outlawed transatlantic slave trade by the time we got to around 1807, 1808. There were still some rogue ships that brought slaves across the Atlantic Ocean to America, but those were few and far between, and certainly illegal by that point. So that meant that as cotton exploded in the South as such a huge cash crop and the demand for labor increased there, individuals, planters in the South, had to come up with a way to obtain slaves, and so that's when the domestic slave trade increased dramatically in America, meaning the domestic, meaning slaves traded within the United States, not brought from outside the United States, but who were in the United States and then sold and traded elsewhere. Virginia is the answer to number three. Virginia produced more slaves that were moved to other states, sold to go to other states than any other state. Number four, in antebellum America, in what region of the country did most free blacks live? The answer might be a little bit surprising, but it was actually the South. More free blacks lived in the South than in the North or Midwest. You might think that blacks who were free might want to move away from the South, but in fact, the majority of them lived in the South and tended to live in urban areas, performing menial tasks where they did not get paid very much, that did not require extensive skills, but still those individuals were free. Number five, what was the Nat Turner Rebellion? That is the most famous slave rebellion that occurred in the United States. It happened here in Virginia in Southampton County, when Nat Turner, who was a slave who believed he had received visions, led a revolt that killed a large number of whites in Southampton County. The response was pretty extreme. The capture and killing of a large number of individuals, including some who were not necessarily involved in the rebellion, but the Nat Turner Rebellion happened in 1831 in Southampton County, Virginia. Number six, what percentage of whites in the South owned 10 or more slaves? That was only approximately 6 to 7% of white Southerners owned 10 or more slaves. If you look in your textbook in chapter 12 in the section titled Slavery in the White Class Structure, there is a chart that indicates that. And I also ask you what percentage of whites in the South did not own slaves at all, and that was approximately 76%, or basically 3 out of every 4 whites in the South did not own slaves. So that brings us to the last question in number 6. Why did so many non-slave holding whites support the institution of slavery in the South? And really, the whole social economic structure in the South was built around the institution of slavery. So many whites who did not own slaves still found stability in that institution and believed that they had a better place in society and the social structure because no matter how bad things were for them, they were at least above slaves, not recognizing that many of the restrictions that they faced in life were probably exacerbated by the existence of slavery. Number 7, what three groups constituted or comprised the white social structure in the South? And if, depending on what book you look at, you will see different terms used for this social structure that existed. At the top of the social structure would be those individuals who were considered planters. The planters were the elite class in the South. A lot of times you were defined as a planter based on the number of slaves you had or based on the amount of land that you owned, which really typically corresponded to the number of slaves that were owned by someone. But that was the top of the social structure. That would be the planter class. And then you had next the small farmers who were known as the yeoman farmers. They were individuals who either owned very few slaves or had no slaves whatsoever, because they did not need slaves because of the amount of land they owned, and they didn't have the money necessary to own a large number of slaves. At the bottom of the rung, after you had the planter class at the top, and then the yeoman farmers in the middle, would just be landless whites. Sometimes you'll hear them referred to as the Pine Barrens people, but those were individuals who did not really possess land in and of themselves. That may have been their ultimate goal or dream, but they had to take on other positions within the social structure because they did not own land. Number 8, what does filibuster mean as it relates to the expansion of slave territory? And then I give you some discussion. The next two parts of the question are actually about different efforts related to filibusters. But filibuster was just an attempt by individuals to expand American-owned or controlled territory in order to expand slavery. So filibuster was an effort to increase the amount of territory that was under the control of the United States, and to do so to expand territories that where slavery existed. So I asked you what was the Austin Manifesto, and I asked you about William Walker. The Austin Manifesto was a doctrine or idea. It really came out in a secret memorandum that was basically bounced around the White House under Franklin Pierce. James Buchanan may have actually been responsible for it, who later became president. But it was this idea for diplomats. The reason it was called the Austin Manifesto is because these diplomats were in Austin, Belgium, to try to secure Cuba so that Cuba could become a slave territory. And the thought was that Spain, who controlled Cuba at the time, was not willing to sell Cuba to the United States, and the United States could then just perform basically a military action to seize Cuba from the Spanish. When this memo was leaked, there was a lot of criticism of it because it seemed to be a clear effort to just expand slave territory, and that was met with a lot of criticism. It would actually be about 45 years later when the United States actually did go to war with Spain over Cuba. Of course, by that time slavery was long gone, and there were other reasons related to why the U.S. became involved in a conflict that dealt with Cuba. The second question, or actually the third part, number 8, is who was William Walker? He was someone who was interested in filibusters, and he actually attempted to accomplish a couple of those. One effort was occurred in Nicaragua. He had previously been involved in Mexico, but in Nicaragua, Walker actually, there's a point where he becomes controls the Nicaraguan government, and was trying to get individuals to support the building of a canal, to have more American involvement in Nicaragua, and to expand to Nicaragua as a slave territory and eventually a slave state in the South. However, he did succeed briefly in controlling Nicaragua. He made slavery legal again there, but eventually he was removed from power, went back to Central America in 1860, and in Honduras, nearby neighboring country in Central America, and he was captured this time and executed. But William Walker was a filibuster who tried to seize Nicaragua as a slave territory for the United States. Those are all the questions in Chapter 12. Okay, number 9 begins our discussion of questions that are in Chapter 13. What was the Second Great Awakening? Well, in many respects, the Second Great Awakening had some similarities to the First Great Awakening, which had occurred relatively early in the 1700s. The Second Great Awakening actually happens around the turn of the century in the late 1700s into the early 1800s, and it's really centered to a large degree on the American frontier towards the western part of states in areas like Kentucky and Tennessee. Those were new states in the 1790s and become some of the centers of this Second Great Awakening. It also, like the First Great Awakening, really focuses on spirituality, not intellectual aspects of religion, but instead on spirituality. And it really is a time period where you have these massive revivals on the frontier with all these outdoor revival meetings, and there was not a whole lot to do on the frontier for entertainment purposes. People were sort of scattered about, and this brought people together, and these sort of revivals were celebratory events, and they helped lead to this just massive change in the American view of religion. The idea of being born again becomes a strong notion as part of American Protestantism, and some of the Protestant denominations that are still the larger Protestant denominations in the country really emerged during this time period. The Baptists, the Methodists, even the Presbyterians, despite the concern about predestination, that was not very popular in the Second Great Awakening, and that's sort of this tenet in Presbyterianism that those denominations, the Baptists, Methodists, Presbyterians, grow quite rapidly during this time period of the Second Great Awakening. There were a lot of famous revivalists who traveled around, who preached to large numbers of people. Perhaps the most famous was a former lawyer who was especially popular in New York, and that was Charles Grandison Finney. He was one of the leading evangelists of the Second Great Awakening. And then the other question I asked you, number 9, was I asked you to identify Richard Allen. Richard Allen was part of the church in Philadelphia that was actually an integrated church, but because he felt like the blacks were sort of treated differently and had limited power within that church, he starts a new denomination, the first major black denomination in America, and that's the African Methodist Episcopal Church, the AME Church, which still exists today. So Richard Allen was the founder of the AME denomination. Number 10, I asked you what was transcendentalism, and this is a bit of a challenging concept. It's really a literary movement that became prominent in the 1830s and 1840s, and it's not easy necessarily to define. Your book defines it as the belief that people can attain an understanding of the world that transcends, that's where the term comes from, transcends sensory experience. In other words, there's more to the world than what you can just experience through sight and touch and smell and hearing, that you can contemplate about things and come to an understanding of things just by just internally, or even almost like meditating within nature and just absorbing concepts or things that allow you to see things more clearly. So again, pretty complicated term becomes important from a literary standpoint in American literature, the notion of transcendentalism, because we have the emergence of some very famous authors, including Ralph Waldo Emerson, famous poet and author, Henry David Thoreau, who becomes significant because of his famous book that he wrote while observing life in the woods in a cabin that was called Walden. Actually, the subtitle was Life in the Woods. We had Walt Whitman, a famous poet. Those were three of the more famous transcendentalists in American literature, and they all had significant contributions. Thoreau's contributions went even beyond just literature. He was an advocate of this concept of civil disobedience, the notion that one could disobey laws that were unjust, and civil disobedience in this case was basically opposition to the expansion of slavery, opposition to America's involvement in the Mexican-American War as a way to expand slavery. So that term civil disobedience will continue to be around, and even in world history we think about someone like Gandhi. He would believe in civil disobedience. And then here in the United States, as we get into the civil rights movement, Martin Luther King Jr. advocated civil disobedience, this concept that Henry David Thoreau put forth in some of his teachings as well. Number 11, who were the Shakers? The Shakers were an American religious group. There were a lot of religious groups that emerged out of what was known as the communal movement, where people were moving into separate areas where they joined with like-thinking people and practice, I think you would say, non-orthodox type religious beliefs. Some were very controversial. Some involved practices, sexual practices that were not very well known, such as spouse swapping, things like that. I mean, there were lots of different groups out there. The Shakers did not belong to that. They were kind of the opposite end, from the standpoint that they actually did not believe strongly in procreation and believed in separating men and women, even if they were married, and they prohibited sexual intercourse, and not surprisingly, the numbers of Shakers continued to decline. But the Shakers, known even today culturally for the furniture style that they developed, their leader was a lady by the name of Mother Ann Lee. She argued that whereas Jesus was the male embodiment of God, she was the mother in Christ. She was the female embodiment of God. But those were the Shakers, a significant religious group during that time period. Some of these other groups we won't ask you to know, like the Oneida community, they had some of those controversial views about sexuality and so on, famous for their development of China, of all things, and there's still a style of China that we see around today. But utopian communities believed that they could form this perfect society, and one of the more famous utopian communities occurred in New Harmony, Indiana. The challenging aspect, though, was that whenever you had a group of people set themselves apart, believing they could have a perfect community, it just didn't work out, because people tend to eventually not get along and ruining that concept of utopia. The last part of, question number 12, who founded the Church of the Latter-day Saints, also known as Mormonism, the Mormon Church? That would be Joseph Smith, and that was also very, at that time especially, a very controversial religious group, because Smith asserted that he had been presented the Book of Mormon, a third testament to the Bible, through golden plates that he had translated. among the more controversial views that the Mormons had at that time period included polygynism, the ability to be married to more than one woman at a time. Whenever the Latter-day Saints went to different areas, they were always received with a great deal of suspicion, and they moved to Nauvoo, Illinois, where they created what they planned on being the center of Mormonism, and it was a very large community with a large number of members of the LDS. But again, it always drew a lot of critics and people who were suspicious. And Joseph Smith actually ended up being he was in prison, and an anti-LDS, anti-Mormon mob stormed the prison, and they actually killed Joseph Smith. So Brigham Young then became the leader of the Mormons and led them to where the temple of the LDS Church is today, out around the Great Salt Lake in what is now Salt Lake City, Utah. Number 13 asks you, what was colonization as it related to slavery? And so this is not the colonization that we think about that we've talked about in American history, where people came from other parts of the world to the Americas. European countries sending people to colonize the region. Instead, this concept was a way to address slavery, as the issue of slavery was a great political concern. So really in the first couple of decades of the 1800s, we get around 1818, 1819, we have the Society for Colonization of Free People of Color. The idea was that this American Colonization Society, it was also called, would basically ship people who were slaves or free blacks back to Africa, and because they felt that was the only way that would be fair and safe for those who had been enslaved, and also for whites, because they did not believe that they could be integrated in society. In fact, some of those who favored this concept helped found a new country in Africa. It's still there, Liberia. The capital of Liberia, Monrovia, was named after President James Monroe, who was the president when that nation was organized. So that colonization means basically sending slaves back to Africa as a solution for issues arising out of slavery. The next question, number 13, what was meant by abolition? Abolition was the term used to describe the elimination of slavery, the abolishing of slavery. Those individuals who supported ending slavery referred to themselves as abolitionists. That was the movement to end or abolish slavery. I ask you who William Lloyd Garrison was. He was one of the more famous white abolitionists. He actually published a newspaper called The Liberator, and the whole focus of the newspaper was about the evils of slavery and how slavery should be ended, abolished in America. I also ask you in question number 13, who was Frederick Douglass? Frederick Douglass was the most famous black abolitionist. Douglass was biracial, born, his mother was a slave, his father was actually the owner of that slave, his mother's master, who as was common with pretty common, slaves would be sexually assaulted, would be raped by black female slaves, would be raped by white owners, and often bear children that were actually the biological children of the slave owners. And that was the case for Frederick Douglass. He was able to escape. He was very articulate, and he was actually overseas when he started writing and received so much support. He was able to purchase his freedom and come back to America, where he became a leading voice for the advancement of blacks in America during the pre-abolition of slavery, during pre-Civil War, but also afterwards. So the most famous black abolitionist was Frederick Douglass. Question number 14 is our last question in chapter 13, and it really deals with the women's rights movement that existed in the 1840s. We tend to think about women's rights being a much more modern concept, but this was one of the first times in American history where there was a conscientious effort to draw attention to the legal issues that women face, their lack of legal standing. We had mentioned the term coverture in Module 2, the idea that women had no independent legal status beyond what their husband had. And so in the 1840s, there was a movement to be more aware of women's issues and the lack of legal standing that women had. This led to, in 1848, first major women's rights conference in America, and that was the Seneca Falls Convention. It occurred in New York. It involved Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Lucretia Mott, others. There was an effort by some to try to tie in women's rights with the abolition movement, so sometimes there were groups that were concerned about both of those things. And even at Seneca Falls, there's some discussion about the issue of slavery, but primarily those things remained separate, and Seneca Falls was just a really important meeting for the advocacy of women's rights. And again, not thinking about that as we would in modern terms, but just very basic advances in the 1840s. Okay, so moving into chapter 14, the first question, number 15, and this will sound familiar because it was also mentioned in your textbook in Module 2 as well, and that's the Compromise of 1850. And we discussed that the Compromise of 1850 allowed California to come in as a free state. It abolished slave trade in Washington, D.C. It basically ended the boundaries that had been created in the Missouri Compromise back in 1819, and it created the concept of popular sovereignty, which we'll talk about more later. But perhaps the most lasting impact of the Compromise of 1850 was the Fugitive Slave Act. The Fugitive Slave Act essentially compelled individuals in the North to help Southern slave hunters track down escaped slaves. That really angered a lot of Northerners, and a lot of individuals who had not really taken a position on slavery in the North became very much anti-slavery because they found themselves in a situation where they had to help re-enslave individuals who escaped slavery. And the other issue, I've mentioned this before back in Module 2, that was problematic is that sometimes these slave hunters, slave chasers from the South would actually capture individuals and take who were free blacks but didn't have their documentation with them and got caught in a bad location, and they ended up being sent to the South as slaves. So a lot of anger directed at the Fugitive Slave Act by Northerners. Number 16, what was the Underground Railroad and who was its most noted leader? That would be Harriet Tubman, who led the Underground Railroad. That was not an actual railroad, but instead it was a network of individuals who worked to help slaves escape slavery from the South and move into areas where they could be free in the North. So they established a network of homes that would hide slaves. They had ways to move individuals. Some of them even ended up in Canada as a way to find more security when they escaped. And so Harriet Tubman was a very famous conductor, so to speak, of the Underground Railroad. It was just a network to help individuals escape slavery and to move them outside of slavery areas. Number 17, who authored Uncle Tom's Cabin? What was the impact of the novel? Uncle Tom's Cabin was a novel that told the story of life on a plantation, and it was very brutal. It was very explicit. It did not hold back anything when it discussed what it was like to be a slave on plantations. And again, Harriet Beecher Stowe was the author. And the second part of that, the impact, was throughout the North. It was a very popular literary work. It sold a lot of copies, and so the impact was it moved some of those individuals who had been neutral about the idea of slavery. Once they read the book, they were brought to tears about how horrible conditions were for slaves, and they opposed slavery. So it really helped, I guess you could say, change the minds of a lot of Northerners about the issue of slavery. Number 18 were the components of the Kansas-Nebraska Act, and what was bleeding Kansas, and what was the doctrine of popular sovereignty. The Kansas-Nebraska Act occurred in the 1854 as more and more people had moved into the Kansas and Nebraska territories. Those territories had to contemplate statehood because they had enough people they could join as states in the United States, no longer be territories. So we talked about how the Compromise of 1850 had basically eliminated the Missouri Compromise, which had set that southern boundary of Missouri. Everything above it would be free, everything below it would be a slave territory. So we said that gets thrown out the window in 1850 with the Compromise of 1850, because that same doctrine of popular sovereignty was used in New Mexico territory as well. And so what popular sovereignty means is you will let the people within a specific territory decide whether or not slavery will exist. So that was what was the doctrine assigned to Kansas and Nebraska territories. So in response to that being the law for those territories, the two groups, the pro-slavery group, the pro-expansion of slavery group, and the group opposed to the expansion of slavery, tried to move as many individuals as they could into those territories so that when there were enough people for the territories to become a state and the people would vote, that their side would win, either the free side or the slave side. In Nebraska, it was never really an issue. There were very few slaves, very few slave holders who moved into Nebraska, the northern territory of the two, and so Nebraska ends up becoming a free state. In Kansas, however, because it bordered Missouri, which was a slave state, there was a lot of contention there. A lot of slaveholders from Missouri moved into Kansas. Not many of them necessarily brought their slaves with them. They just wanted to occupy the territory so that when there was a vote within that territory, when it was becoming a state, that the slave side would win out. Those opposed to the expansion of slavery start to become known as the Free Soilers. They tried to do the same thing, moving individuals of their side, their view, into those opposed to the expansion of slavery into Kansas. And so what happens after 1854 is essentially a mini civil war that breaks out in Kansas, and that's why it becomes known as Bleeding Kansas. There are some attacks. A group called Quantrill's Raiders, that the James brothers actually become involved with them, and Bloody Bill Anderson and these folks from Missouri who are in favor of the expansion of slavery. They actually attack Lawrence, Kansas, which is today probably most famously known as the location for the University of Kansas, and the pro-slavery folks attack the town. They kill large numbers of Kansans. They burn down the city, all in the idea that that pro-slavery will prevail. Lawrence had been a anti-slavery free solar hotbed, so that's why it was attacked. So essentially, Bleeding Kansas refers to this notion of a mini civil war that occurs in Kansas in the 1850s until it shakes out in the end that it's the Free Soilers who prevail in Kansas, and Kansas will eventually be admitted as a free state, but a lot of violence prior to that time. Number 19, what led to the formation of the Republican Party? So we are talking about the modern Republican Party, not the individuals associated with Thomas Jefferson that we refer to as the Democratic Republican Party, that eventually the majority of them turn into the Democratic Party. Instead, we're talking about a new Republican Party, the modern day Republican Party, at least in its roots, was founded in 1850s out of the Free Soil movement. The Free Soilers were individuals who were opposed to the expansion of slavery into any new territories or states. Out of that, you have a group of individuals, some who had been Democrats, some who had been part of the Whig Party, which the Whig Party falls apart totally because of the issue of slavery. The Democrats nearly do, and it's going to cost them in the 1860 election. But this new party emerges called the Republican Party. Now, the Republican Party today has vastly different views on a lot of issues. Obviously, the issues are vastly different than 170 years later. But in 1856, the Republican Party that was created is the roots of the modern Republican Party. And again, it was built on the concept of free soil party, that it would not would be opposed. It would be opposed to the expansion of slavery. Actually, ran a presidential candidate in the 1856 election. John Fremont, who had been involved in the Mexican-American War, had helped capture California briefly before, and created that Bear Flag Republic before the U.S. came in and said, no, this is ours. But he ran as the Republican candidate, did not win, did not really do a lot, but the foundation was set for the shocking results in the 1860 election for the Republicans. The next question, number 20, what was determined in the Dred Scott decision? The Dred Scott decision was one of the more significant U.S. Supreme Court decisions as far as its historical impact. The decision was about a case in which a slave had sued his master, and really his master's family, because his master had died, that to establish that he was free because for an extended time period his owner had taken him, Dred Scott, the slave, from Missouri, which is a slave state, and taken him into areas like Illinois and Wisconsin that were free territories. And because he had lived for a time period in those free territories, he claimed then that he should then be free. Well, what happens in the U.S. Supreme Court case, they don't really get to that question about can a free individual or a slave living in free territory then lose his status as slave. Instead, they kind of go the complete opposite direction. Roger Taney, who was from Maryland, was the Chief Justice, and he rules that really, even though it didn't have a lot to do with that specific case, he basically says that if you're a slave, you have no legal rights. So that should have ended the case, but he goes beyond that and says that since slaves have no legal rights, they are the property of their owners, that owners of slaves can take those slaves anywhere and keep them as slaves. So throughout the 1800s, we've been talking about the conflict between free states and slave states, and Dred Scott now is saying it doesn't matter. You can't truly be a free state because if the individual owner of slaves takes the slaves to a free state, he can still maintain those slaves as slaves. Whether it's New York or Pennsylvania or Michigan, it doesn't matter. Even though those states slavery is illegal, because slaves are property, they can be taken into those states. Now, that decision was roundly criticized as just a dreadful decision, and it was never really implemented, but it created enough tension that it really is a factor that helped leads to the Civil War, because it doesn't seem like you can politically resolve the issue of slavery by maintaining a balance between slave states and free states, because the U.S. Supreme Court in the Dred Scott case is saying there are no free states. Slavery can be taken anywhere and maintained as slaves. So that's the Dred Scott decision. Number 21, who were the candidates for U.S. Senate from Illinois in 1858? And you may be wondering why I'm asking about an Illinois senatorial race in 1858. And because it had two very famous candidates, two candidates who will be candidates for the presidency in 1860, just 2 years later. And really it proves that there's no easy answers to the issue of slavery and expansion of slavery. The Democrats in that case ran Stephen Douglas as their candidate. The Republicans ran Abraham Lincoln in the Illinois senatorial race as their candidate. And at debates, Lincoln puts the pressure on Stephen Douglas. Douglas had been an advocate of popular sovereignty and had made comments that, hey, slavery will not expand. There are some areas of the country where it's just not conducive to agriculture, and therefore slavery will not exist there. And he was talking about places like Utah and New Mexico and Arizona. And so that upset a lot of Southern Democrats who had been supporters of Douglas. Now, that didn't affect the election in Illinois because Douglas wins the U.S. Senate race, but it hurts his chances at being a Democrat who can win around the country because Southern Democrats now believe that Douglas has acknowledged that slavery, that he's in favor of popular sovereignty because it will be a vessel to keep slavery from spreading in some areas, and that upset Southern Democrats. By the time we get to the 1860 presidential election, there will be a split between Northern Democrats and Southern Democrats. Douglas, of course, is a Northern Democrat, so he has no chance to win the 1860 presidential election. He does win the U.S. Senate election in 1858. Abraham Lincoln loses, but Abraham Lincoln becomes more of a national figure because of his debating skills, because of his ability to paint Douglas into a corner, and so that really gets Lincoln much more well known, so that he will become a Republican candidate in 1860 who is actually able to win the presidential election. Number 22, what happened at Harper's Ferry? Harper's Ferry at the time was a federal arsenal in Virginia. Today, Harper's Ferry is in West Virginia because of what happens during the Civil War, but at that point it was in Virginia. And John Brown was an individual who was a radical abolitionist. He was opposed to slavery on every conceivable means. He was opposed to slavery. In fact, he had led an attack by his sons and followers on individuals in Kansas during the Bleeding Kansas. He killed a number of individuals, including some young boys in Potawatomi, and it wasn't even clear that they belonged to pro-slavery families, but they were killed. And so now he leads his sons and some former slaves and escaped slaves with 18 armed men essentially to the federal arsenal in Harper's Ferry, Virginia, where they want to capture weapons. His idea is he's going to capture these weapons at the arsenal, and then they will spread out through the Appalachian region down through Virginia into the mountains of North Carolina and South Carolina, disperse these weapons, distribute these weapons to slaves, lead this great slave uprising, and end slavery in the South. Instead, what happens in Harper's Ferry is the townspeople are very angry. They surround the arsenal. Eventually, several of his sons and supporters are killed. Eventually, John Brown is captured. He is charged with treason against Virginia. He's found guilty, and he is hanged. And that really is another point where it looks like we are inevitably moving towards war. A lot of people consider John Brown a hero. Others, depending on your view at that time period on the expansion of slavery and his means, others considered him essentially a terrorist. But it draws a lot of attention to the issue of slavery, and so that's why Harper's Ferry is so important. Of course, it ends up being in West Virginia because we'll see as we get into the Civil War that there are large portions of Virginia where counties do not want to secede from the United States, and so they end up forming their own state, which becomes known as West Virginia when it's established in 1863. So the last question for Chapter 14, who won the election of 1860? And I've mentioned the answer already. That was Abraham Lincoln, the Republican candidate. That's important because many Southerners are convinced that Lincoln wants to end slavery, and they do not believe that the Southern slave states can continue to exist in peace as part of the United States if you have a president who is opposed to slavery. In reality, at that point, Lincoln had only expressed his desire to prevent slavery from expanding, not to abolish slavery. But that's not how he was viewed in the South. So the Republican candidate, Abraham Lincoln, wins the election of 1860. So that's the last question in Chapter 14.